Very good to see all of you here for the Bible study, our first Bible study of 2005. We are getting into the book of Daniel this evening. We've been, of course, going through a series on the writings, and we went through Psalms, Proverbs, and Job in some detail. And then we have been more recently in the 5 festival scrolls of Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Now, actually, the book of Daniel is included in with the writings. It is the next book we would come to in terms of the writings. Now, we have already gone through earlier in the inspired order. The book of Daniel is followed by Ezra, Nehemiah, and then the book of Chronicles. And those represent the post-exilic books, the books that were written after the exile. When we went through the historical survey of the Old Testament, we went through Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles at that time, just sort of following through the story flow. So we will not go back through them, but rather when we conclude the book of Daniel, we're going to do Daniel in 2 sections, and when we conclude the book of Daniel, then we will get directly into the minor prophets and do a series on the 12 minor prophets. But I want us to look a little bit at Daniel and to understand initially the background of the book. Daniel, of course, was taken captive. One of the great pivot points in the history of ancient Israel and Judah was, of course, the captivity and the destruction of Jerusalem. That was such a very major point, right on the par with the events, the Exodus in a positive way, the entrance into the Promised Land, the establishment of the kingdom. But at this point, we have God's judgment that has come on the nation. And it came progressively. It's interesting how many times there are patterns of 3 in terms of finality. We find that there were 3 invasions and 3 captivities of Judah. The first is the one that Daniel was taken captive in. We know when this occurred. It was the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged the city. And Nebuchadnezzar did not destroy the city at that time. He made it a tributary state, and he took Daniel and a number of other young Jewish lads as captives to Babylon. And one of Nebuchadnezzar's ideas was to build a sort of a professional civil service in Babylon, composed of not just the sons of wealthy, influential people in Babylon, but rather his policy was that as his empire expanded, he selected out some of the what seemed to him to be, or to his top generals, the most promising young men. And they selected them out, and they brought them to Babylon, and they entered this sort of training school or college, whatever you want to call it, in which they were instructed in the Chaldean language and in various other things relating to, let's say, education as it stood in ancient Babylon. And there were examinations, just as you have in the civil service exam, and those who scored high were given higher jobs and had opportunity to work their way up. One of the reasons that Nebuchadnezzar, in that sense, was successful. Now, one of the other factors along that line that was in common with most of the kingdoms of the East, they were always worried that some of the ones who were down the ladder, some of the civil servants, some of the administrators, would wind up wanting to advance themselves and their family and their dynasty rather than advancing the king. See, that's always a problem, that people have families and their children grow up, and, they want to advance their sons, want to see their sons advance. And so the king, not only of Babylon, but of most of those areas of the East, had a solution for that that persisted in some areas of the East all the way down to modern times. And that was the fact that those in the civil service had no children to advance. That's why you find the term eunuch became almost synonymous with servant in terms of the king's court. Now, not that every single one was, and in some cases the term eunuch came to be sort of a generic term applied to civil servants, but so I don't know that you can prove the matter entirely, but one of the things that it is, that was a custom. The eunuchs were not only used to guard the king's harem, but that was the other factor of it. And of course, the civil servants were continually going and coming from the palace, which is where the harem was. So the king had his ways of sort of assuring some of those things. So we find that Daniel and his friends were delivered to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, and so that certainly gives rise to the idea that this is what happened to Daniel and his friends. One of the things I think as we go through the book of Daniel, I'd like to go through it on a couple of different levels. One, on the personal level, because the book tells the story of Daniel. Secondly, on a different level, a prophetic level. One of the remarkable things, the book of Daniel stands out in a way that is different from the other prophetic books in the Old Testament. It is the most like the book of Revelation. Most of the prophetic books in the Old Testament, or virtually all of them, as we will see when we go on through the minor prophets, they are arranged usually in the order that certain prophecies were given. Usually the formula is, the word of the Lord came unto so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, in such and such a year, and then it records the prophecy, the statement. And then a little later, the word of the Lord came again unto so-and-so, and it may be at a year later or 6 months later or whatever it is. And what you find is in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and mostly in the minor prophets, the prophecies are arranged in the order in which they were received. That's what you generally find. And they were grouped not by subject so much as by the revelation that God gave at a particular time. Now, Daniel arranges itself that way, but one of the things that Daniel does in Daniel 2 and in Daniel 7 in a very special way is he starts in his day. He makes it very plain that he's starting in his day, the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And he runs a successive prophecy all the way until the time when the God of heaven sets up a kingdom. Now, understand that the problem that's created in the other prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, you can go through and read a lot of different prophecies. The trouble is that if it weren't for other books in the Bible, you wouldn't know how those prophecies related to one another in terms of time sequence, which event happened here and then what came next and what came next, because they're not arranged in a sequential order. Now, the idea in the ancient world was, of course, that there were many gods. And each nation had its own gods, and they worshipped, this god or that god, sort of their national god. And the rulers of the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, were willing to let the other nations worship their gods. In fact, they were generally willing to accept the fact, well, yes, you're gods, but then, see, if we went to war with you and we won the war, then obviously our gods are stronger than your gods. So you can keep worshiping yours, but you got to worship ours too. And the fact that we went to war, I won and you lost, that proves that my God is stronger than your God. And so what do you find when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem? Remember when he finally destroyed the temple? And even before then, he had looted the place, and he brought treasures of the temple, and he put them in the temple of his God there in Babylon. You see, the idea was he had carried off trophies, and his God was the winner. I mean, that was the way he looked at it, and the way most did. And so he brought in, generally from most of these nations, when they conquered them, these nations would have their temple with their idol that they worshipped. They would normally bring the idol and set it up there in the temple there in Babylon. And so it was sort of a trophy, But of course, they didn't have any statue or anything like that to bring from to bring from Jerusalem, and there's no evidence whatsoever that they brought the Ark of the Covenant. What happened to it is, of course, a matter of speculation because the Bible doesn't say. I think we know that. See, we have a list of the things that they brought, and the ark isn't mentioned. That would have been the most valuable thing. I mean, we know they brought the pillars of brass in front of the temple, and they brought various things, but they didn't. The ark is never mentioned as having been brought. There's no Jewish tradition that it was brought. Later, when Cyrus allowed Ezra to take things back, Cyrus allowed Zerubbabel to take certain things back, and later Artaxerxes allowed Ezra to take the rest of it. There's no mention of the ark. There was not an Ark of the Covenant in the Second Temple. The Holy of Holies was empty. And that's one of the three things that were missing from the Second Temple that were present in Solomon's Temple, the Ark of the Covenant. So God allowed the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem and to destroy the temple. He did not allow them to take the Ark of the Covenant, symbolic of His presence. He did not allow them to have that as a trophy. Now, where it went and who hid it, there are varying traditions. I would suspect that Jeremiah, who was a priest as well as a prophet, was probably responsible for overseeing the removal of the Ark, and whether it's hidden in Ireland, as some traditions hold, or whether it's hidden, in some secret cavern there, on Mount Moriah in the General Temple complex, whether it's hidden somewhere else, I don't know, but I suspect that in God's time we'll find that it still exists. Daniel, nevertheless, is brought there. So we get back that in the midst of all of this, one of the things God gave Daniel was the fact that God was still in charge. That it wasn't just He was the God of Judah or the God of Israel. He was the God of the whole world, and He could foresee and could declare the rise and fall of the Gentile powers. And that all of these nations, these Gentile powers, their empires would ebb and flow. They were temporary. And eventually the God of heaven was going to set up a kingdom that would never be removed. And so that story runs through. Now, when you start out here in the book of Daniel, the first thing we're introduced to, just on a personal level, Daniel is taken. This is about 604 B.C. when he and his friends are selected, or at least are among the group that is selected, and they're brought back to Babylon. And the king, see, he's going to really be generous. He wants them well educated. They're going to be housed there in an annex to the palace, and they're going to be fed with the king's food. Boy, it doesn't get any better than that, right? Well, not if you like shrimp and oysters and pork chops and all the rest of it. It was a lot of things that the king ate. And so the very first test, they were probably on army rations on the way back from and that would have been more grains and dried fruits and cheeses and things that would make a long trip. But when they got back there, and in effect the announcement was made, well, you boys are really lucky. The king is going to let you eat what he eats. Daniel, of course, knew what that meant. And so here he is faced with a problem. And he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, verse 8, with this portion of the king's meat or the wine that he drank. Understand that the wine normally was one of the objections that the Jews had to that, was normally the first libation of the vintage was poured out to one of the various gods, and it was considered offered to idols. And that being the case, well, it was like an idolatrous ceremony. Of course, a lot of the meat would have been as well. So we find that Daniel made a request that he could be excused from eating this. God had brought him into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now, think about it from Daniel's perspective. You know, you and I don't really get to choose most of our trials in life. Now, sometimes we choose a trial by doing something stupid and, bringing some consequence on ourselves, and I guess in that sense we get to choose it. But a lot of times things happen. How do you handle it? You know, Daniel and his friends were taken here to Babylon. You think Daniel and his friends were the worst kids in Jerusalem, and that's why they got jerked away from their families and hauled off? No. In fact, as you read the story, they must have been some of the best kids in Jerusalem. You know, it's easy to understand when bad things happen to bad people. That makes sense. But the trouble, of course, is sometimes understanding why bad things happen to people who are trying to do what was right. So here we find Daniel removed from his family, removed from his homeland, transported into a new place, and, he's made friends of the man that has oversight of him. But who is this fellow? The prince of the eunuchs. That'd be wonderful news if you're a young fellow to hear that that's who you're being delivered to. You look at it from a standpoint, put yourself in Daniel's standpoint. The trouble you and I have sometimes with that is we've already read the whole book. We know how it ends up, and, here's this great righteous man. Well, no, actually at this point, here's this 15, 16-year-old boy who has been uprooted from everything and must have been as mystified as to why all this was happening to him, when he could probably think of various people that he knew back in Jerusalem that were a whole lot worse than he was, that they didn't get hauled off to Babylon. But notice his attitude. Daniel at this point clearly could not have understood the why behind everything he was going through. But what he did know was that he believed in God, and he believed in God's law, and he didn't want to break God's law. And so this, in a sense, was the first test. See, here was a test of Daniel's commitment and his attitude, and the prince of the eunuchs basically told him, verse 10, I like you, but I fear the king. You're a nice boy, and I like you, but the king, he's got quite a temper, and he told me what to feed you, and he looks at you, and you look worse than the others, and then he finds out that I didn't follow his instructions. I'm a dead man. And so Daniel then does not stop there. He goes to Melzar, the specific man that the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel. And he makes him a deal. He says, look, give us 10 days. Give us fruits and vegetables, give us whole grain, give us water, and then let's compare us to the others. And so, king's not going to check on anybody in the next 10 days. So he consented, said, we'll do it for 10 days. Well, at the end of 10 days, they were looking better and healthier than everybody else. You can imagine, these others, number one, they were probably had food they'd never seen before. They had been on the trail from wherever they had been taken captive all the way back to Babylon. They get here, they've been on sort of army rations for a period of weeks. Now it's sort of the all-you-can-eat buffet that is set out there. So what do? They gorge themselves on it. What happens? Well, they get sick, they eat a bunch of rich stuff, their faces breaking out, they're just, they're eating all sorts of things. So Daniel and his friends, they look healthy. Well, the Melzar said, okay, well, that's good enough for me. You boys are healthier than the rest of them, so you can have what you want. Well, now, in the aftermath of this, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. God then, see, they took a step of showing their commitment and their loyalty to God. God then, they were capable, talented young fellows to begin with, but God just gave them that sort of extra amount. And Daniel had particular understanding in terms of visions and dreams. Well, we find that when all was said and done, the latter part of chapter 1 just gives a summary that when finally they came to the end of their 3 years in their time of examination, nobody could stand up to the four of them. And Daniel continued a very lengthy time all the way down past the fall of Babylon, the time of King Cyrus. Well, chapter 2 picks it up about a year after Daniel and his friends had been there. This was the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He dreamed a dream, and his spirit was very troubled, and he called for the magicians, and he called for the astrologers, and he called for all the people that were supposed to know all this stuff, and he said, I want you to tell me what I dreamed and what it meant. Well, we've gone over this particular thing a number of times, and of course, they weren't able to do that. They told him, they said, well, if you'll tell us what you dreamed, we can tell you what it meant. And the king said, oh, no, you don't. If you can tell me what it means, you ought to be able to tell me what I dreamed. And they said, well, nobody can do that. And Nebuchadnezzar said, fine, I'll chop you all up into little pieces and tear your house down. So he was worse than the big bad wolf of the story. And the king was angry, verse 12, and very furious. So word went out, and Daniel, of course, heard about it, and this would have applied to him. And Daniel told the captain of the king's guard, he said, look, what's going on? And it was explained to him. And Daniel then let it be known that he would show the king the interpretation. Went to his house and made the thing known to his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret. Then we find the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. At the time Daniel volunteered, he didn't know the answer. He stepped out on faith. And Daniel, of course, was very thankful. And he noted here in verse 21 about God that he changed the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings, gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to them that know understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. God is the source of knowledge. So when Daniel came into the king, he answered here in verse 27, that the secret you've required, nobody around you has been able to tell. Verse 28, but there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets, and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. So we notice a couple of things. One, it's emphasized right from the beginning that the God of heaven is the one who reveals secrets. He is the one who has knowledge. And Daniel made this point to King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had enough problem with pride anyway, and he had defeated Judah, and he needed to be reminded, and the Babylonian empire that ruled over Judah needed to be reminded that their victory was not because of God's weakness. It was because of Judah's sin and God allowing them to go into captivity. Another thing we find right here, when is this prophecy for? Verse 28. What shall be in the latter days? So here's a prophecy for the end time, not just for ancient history. So Daniel then describes to him what he saw, a great image, and he describes this great bright image, and it was very awe-inspiring. The head was of fine gold, and the chest and the silver and the arms were silver. The belly and the thighs were brass, and the legs of iron, and the feet were part of iron and part of clay. And the last thing that he saw was a stone of supernatural origin, a stone that was cut out without hands, that smote the image upon his feet, the feet of iron and clay, and it broke them to pieces. And the whole thing then became like chaff and blew away. Now this is the dream, verse 36, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. He said, so Daniel then explains to him in the end of verse 38, you are this head of gold. So he describes the great empire of Babylon. So we know the starting point. You know, one of the things, people just jump around on prophecy and anything that happens. Boy, they'll, yeah, well, that's talking about this. I can remember years ago back, the beast is described as, in Revelation, as a scarlet-colored beast. Well, those of you who remember back to the 60s remember, in the 50s and 60s, that the communists were the enemy. And what did we call the communists? The Reds. So just about any preacher that preached on prophecy, if he was going to preach on prophecy, well, this was world communism. That was the beast. Well, where did they get that? Well, they just sort of grabbed it out of the air. You see, what we're given here is a progression. We know when we start with the head of gold. That represented Babylon in Daniel's day. That's the starting point. You don't have to guess. It says so right here. What is the ending? Well, it's when the God of heaven sets up a kingdom that'll never be removed. That is described on down here in verse 44. So everything that happens in a period of a little over 26 centuries. And, most of us are familiar with computers. Let me throw out an analogy for you. We all wonder, how close are we to the end? Well, from the days, if you're looking at this image, you know how sometimes somebody sends you a picture on the computer, and if you got particularly something slow like mine, it just seems like it goes on, it's downloading, and you see the little bar flash up there, and the percentage that you download, and you sit there and you wait, and finally, 100% download. Well, we know when this started. See, it started 26 centuries ago, about 600 BC. And if this was a computer image, then what you'd have to say is it's a little over, it's probably 99% plus downloaded. Because if you've got 26 centuries, 26 years is 1%, right? So, however close to the end, we're probably at least 99% downloaded on this image. You just about, you hadn't quite got to where the stone smashes the feet, but that's getting close. The image is almost totally downloaded. And anyway, Daniel goes through and he explains that this is a succession of kingdoms. And this is made very plain in verse 40, the fourth kingdom. See, in verse 39, after you, he's talking to Nebuchadnezzar, shall arise another kingdom inferior to you, and another third kingdom of brass, which will bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. Well, it's pretty plain, you just go through history. The book of Daniel records the first succession as we go from Babylon to Persia. A couple of hundred years later brings you down to the Greek Empire, and then we know that Rome swallowed the whole thing up. And then we come down to the toes that were part of iron and part of clay, partly strong, partly broken. It is not a it is not a cohesive mixture, but it's not going to mix well, but it will mix for a little while. And in the days of these final 10 kings, God sets up a kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, is really overcome by all this. He's just so impressed. Nobody's been able to tell him, and he, verse 46, falls on his face and worships Daniel, and commands that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors to him, like he was a god. And he says, your God is a God of gods. So he made Daniel a great man, gave him many gifts. And Daniel, of course, requested that his three friends be given responsibility as well. Well, did Nebuchadnezzar really get the point? No. You get into chapter 3. What did he do? Next thing we read is Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. This huge image that he sets up, and evidently it was gold plate. I mean, when you look at the size of the image, but it was a colossal image nevertheless, had a golden appearance. set up there in the plains of there in the outskirts of Babylon, and he is going to have this great ceremony, and everybody, at least all of the leadership, everybody who is anybody, is invited to the party. The orchestra is going to strike up the band, and everybody bows down to the image. Well, you know the story. There were some folks that were standing by. You know, they were jealous of Daniel and his friends. Now, we're not told where Daniel was. He's not in this story, so he's evidently somewhere else. But his three friends were there, and so they were in the group. And some of the Chaldeans came, these astrologers, and they said, "Now, King, didn't you make this decree? Everybody's supposed to bow down." "Oh, yes, that's the decree made." He said, "Well, there are some Jews that you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego, and they don't serve your gods, and they don't worship the golden image." Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego to be brought. And so they came, and he said, "You know what? I've heard you don't serve my gods. Now, I'm going to give you boys one more chance. And if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the music, you can bow down and worship the image, but if not, I'm going to throw you in the midst of a burning fiery furnace, and who is the God that can deliver you out of my hand?" Now, that is not a real smart question to ask, you know, because you may get an answer to it. Nebuchadnezzar was about to get the answer. He found out, that as you go through the story, you find that one of the besetting problems of Nebuchadnezzar was pride. So he learns that at the height of his empire building, that the God of heaven has already decreed the rise and fall of nations. You know, if you were just looking at it from a human standpoint, it would seem that Babylon was just going to be on the scene indefinitely. But Daniel was already giving God's pronouncement that it was coming to an end. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego said, "We don't need to take time to think this over. Our God, whom we serve," verse 17, "is able to deliver us." You ask the question, who's able to? Our God is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand. See, they didn't know one way or the other they were going to be delivered. Either delivered from the furnace or certainly delivered out of Nebuchadnezzar's hand, because if they died, what was going to happen to them? Well, the next split second of their consciousness, they were going to be in the resurrection. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is full of fury, and boy, he gets mad. You know, he sort of liked these boys up until then. Now he's really mad. And he commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more. Now, if you've ever seen pictures of these were the great smelting furnaces there on the plains of Babylon. And they had a hand-operated bellows, sort of a clay pipe that came into the furnace through which air traveled, and at a distance away was this huge bellows that took several slaves to operate. And they would pump this thing up and down, and you know how the principle of heating up a furnace, like the old blacksmith furnaces and that sort of thing, that was used here in the smelting of metals. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's so mad that he wants this thing heated, and boy, these guys out there, they're double teaming and they're working it up and down, and the whole furnace is just glowing. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar has these 3 Jews bound, and he has the soldiers demand to take them up there and throw them in. Well, they get there to the point to throw them in, and the heat is so intense, and that the soldiers faint and die right there. I mean, you know, you get and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego were thrown in, but the soldiers who took them up there, just getting that close, the intense heat and lack of oxygen caused them to collapse, and they died. Well, they were bound. They had all their clothes on, and they were bound, as it describes in verse 21. And in a minute, Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. Verse 24. And he rose up in haste. He said to his counselors, "Didn't we throw 3 men in there?" And they said, "Oh, that's right, King." And he said, "Well, I see we threw 3 men in bound, and I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire." and they have no hurt. And the form of the first is like the Son of God. Now, we're not told what it is that made Nebuchadnezzar connect the fourth being with the Son of God, but I would suppose that he was glowing brighter than the furnace. He obviously in some ways stood out from the other three. I mean, they all evidently had similar shape and that sort of thing. Looked like four men, but there was something different about the fourth one. I suspect that he was glowing a lot brighter than anything else in there. And, there was an appearance that even the king realized that this is not ordinary. Well, he gets as near as he can, and he calls out to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego very respectfully, you servants of the Most High God, come forth. And so they came forth. And the princes and the governors and the captains, the king's counselors were gathered together, and they saw the men. And the fire hadn't had any power on them. There wasn't even a singed smell. Their hair wasn't singed, even their garments. Well, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants." And so he is very impressed. Well, we get into chapter 4, and we find a third factor. You find three things that are brought out, you see, to sort of humble Nebuchadnezzar. The first is the dream and the foretelling of the future all the way down to the latter days. The second is the deliverance from the fiery furnace. The fourth involves this other dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. This was a number of years later, and chapter 4 is actually something that Nebuchadnezzar himself wrote. It's incorporated into the book. He said in verse 4, "I was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace." And he had this dream that made him afraid. And he asked to have it interpreted, and the magicians and the astrologers couldn't tell him what it meant. But Daniel came in. Daniel heard about this, and he came in. And Daniel, was asked, what does it mean? And this time Nebuchadnezzar tells him the dream about this great tree that grew up, and then how he saw a holy one come down from heaven. And verse 14, "Cry aloud, say, hew down the tree, cut off the branches, shake the leaves, scatter the fruit, and let the beast get away from under it. But leave the stump, and band it with iron and brass in the tender grass of the field." And so the heart was changed from a man's heart to a beast's heart, and 7 times passed over. Well, this matter is by decree of the watchers and by demand of the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, told what it was, and Daniel just stands here astonished because Daniel understands the implications of it, and he says, "Look, this, what this means is that, verse 25, they're going to drive you from men. Your dwelling is going to be with the beasts of the field, and they'll make you eat grass like an oxen, and 7 times will pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will." So then Daniel proceeded to give him some advice. He said in verse 27, "Let my counsel be acceptable unto you. Break off your sins by righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. It may lengthen your tranquility." Well, I suspect that for the next few days you couldn't have run into a nicer fellow than old Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, he was tippy-toeing around the palace and saying please and thank you, and just as nice a fellow as you'd ever want to meet. But you know what? The tendency of human nature is to get forgetful. So, a few days passed by, nothing drastic happened. A week went by, a month went by, And, gradually this sort of fades in the king's mind because nothing drastic happens. And, it's interesting. You look at things after some big disaster. I remember talking to someone who was taking a tour there in England, and one of the big cathedrals, and huge place, and I think they were asking the tour guide, well, this is sure a vast place, vast auditorium. How many people attend church here? Well, just a handful, not many. But then the tour guide, who was an older man, told them, he said, but I remember once, I remember when it was full. And he was talking about the time back after the evacuation from Dunkirk. And, people just all over, just crowding in the place. It sort of reminded me of my barber in Kilgore. We were talking, and he was a kid during World War II, and we were talking, and he brought up something similar, talked about how, so many of the young men in the little community where he lived were in the Army and overseas, and talked about how they had a revival there at the little country church where he attended, and the thing was so full that they just had seats on the inside for the women and the children and the men, and the older boys had to stand up outside the windows, and listen in, because it was the place was so crowded. It's interesting, seeing a disaster or something really drastic happens, people get scared. People are scared, they turn to God. But a little time goes by, and it's like then they relax, and they just sort of go back to being the way they used to. Nebuchadnezzar got all stirred up for a little bit while. But by the time you get a year down the road, see, that's where we pick up the story next in verse 29, at the end of 12 months, he's walking around, sort of strutting around and looking out, and says, is not this great Babylon that I've built for the house of the kingdom of the might of my power, for the honor of my majesty? Look what I've done, and look how great I am. He built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He was a great, impressive conqueror and builder. Well, boy, at the time he said that, a voice rang from heaven, and it said, they're going to drive, your kingdom is departed from you. And so we find that in the same hour, Nebuchadnezzar just became insane, became like an animal, and was driven out, and wound up for the next 7 years roaming the fields and the forests like an animal. Out there until he was acting like an animal, looked like an animal. Where do you think some of the legends of the werewolves out howling at the moon came from? Well, I suspect that some of that probably started back here with Nebuchadnezzar. And 7 years go by. And at the end of that time, suddenly Nebuchadnezzar lifts up his eyes to heaven, and his understanding returns to him. Instead of howling at the moon, he blessed the Most High and praised and honored him that lives forever. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he does according to his will in the army of heaven among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. Well, his reason returned, and he came back, and his glory of his kingdom was given back to him, and he was established. And so Nebuchadnezzar's point, verse 37, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he's able to abase.